For nearly 15 years, two of the most powerful nations faced each other in an epic showdown of wills and international power. Though they never engaged in direct combat, the United States and the Soviet Union spent the second half of the 20th century at each other's throats. Capitalism, widespread religion, and democracy were pitted against communism, state-sponsored atheism, and totalitarian leaders. With both nations sitting at the head of large international coalitions, the Cold War effectively saw half of the world challenge the other half, the lion's share of political and social influence. Many people today remember the Cold War through the international events that it birthed: the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Suez Crisis, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan were all ripple effects of the greater conflict between East and West. However, a topic that is not remembered as deeply, at least in the West, is the stark differences in views on human rights between the two different factions. The United States and its allies were by no means flawless in their upholding of human rights, but if nothing else, they had laws in place that theoretically supported the pursuit of equal and humane treatment. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, took a different view on the question of humanity. A chilling example of this difference is the Pitesti Prison Experiment. Taking place from 1949 to 1952, the Pitesti Experiment was an attempt by the authorities of the Pitesti prison in Romania to re-educate political dissidents, students, and other criminals and place them back into the fold of the political ideals held by the Romanian and, by extension, Soviet government. The methods they used to accomplish this unleashed a reign of terror upon the inmates of the prison for the better part of 3 years and resulted in a secret government trial and fatal consequences. In this video, we will provide some context on the situation in Romania at the time, discuss the origins of the experiment, the methods used, and the final dissolution of the Pitesti Prison Experiment. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, King Carol II of Romania declared that his nation would remain neutral in the conflict. However, as France fell to the German armies and Britain retreated out of Europe, the voices of the fascist elements in the Romanian government grew louder and louder. In late 1940, they staged a coup, and shortly afterward, Romania joined the fascist alliance. Romanian soldiers participated in the invasion of the Soviet Union, and when the tides of the war turned against Germany and its allies in 1943 and 1944, Romania found itself bombed by Allied forces and invaded by the Red Army. Though a handful of fascist leaders managed to escape, the majority of them were imprisoned or executed by the Red Army and the communist government that the Soviet Union installed after the war. Installed in 1947, the government of the People's Republic of Romania spent the next decade asserting its relative independence from the Soviet Union, with the last Red Army troops being removed from the country by 1958. Before we get into the specifics of the Pitesti Experiment, it is important to acknowledge that the period from the 1950s to the 1970s were generally a time of advancement and success in Romania. The country saw an economic rise, improvements in infant mortality and life expectancy, increased literacy and urbanization, and greater support for women's rights. However, the early period of Romanian communism also saw abuses of power and examples of torture and abuse in the name of re-education. The Pitesti Experiment is one of these examples. At the time of its construction in 1941, Pitesti Prison was the most modern detention facility in Romania. Initially, it was used to hold high school students convicted for treason in the Legionnaires' Rebellion, when members of the fascist Iron Legion tried to overthrow the government of Romania, which ironically was also fascist, just led by a different group. Shortly after the foundation of the People's Republic of Romania, Pitesti Prison was primarily occupied by people convicted of various misdemeanor charges. However, when the Securitate, the Romanian secret police, took over the domestic intelligence wing of the Romanian government in 1948, the prison began to receive prisoners convicted of having Western and/or anti-Soviet ideals. Most of these inmates were university students. In 1949, Alexander Dumitrescu took over as the director of Pitesti Prison. By April, he was faced with implementing a program that was backed by the power and influence of the Securitate. to undertake a re-education endeavor that would convert the political descendants of his prison into full communists. Prior attempts at a re-education program had been conducted at a different Romanian prison, but the results had been middling at best. With this in mind, the newly appointed enforcer of the Pitesti experiment, Eugen Turcanu, decided that the Pitesti program would be different than its predecessor in one important way: violence. Dumitrescu was initially opposed to the use of violence, but by the end of the experiment, he was as involved in the methods used as anyone else. The main force behind the use of violence by the Pitesti experiment was Turcanu. Eugen Turcanu had been a member of the Iron Guard before its dissolution, but became a communist shortly before the rise of the Securitate. He was imprisoned in Pitesti after he was purged from the party and was chosen as the leader of the group of prisoners that would conduct the experiment. Turcanu assembled a group of fellow prisoners to oversee the re-education methods being used in Pitesti, and they became his personal assistants, the ODCC. Though at first glance it seems that Turcanu took his orders directly from Dumitrescu, the prison director, but further investigations have found that Turcanu may have been receiving his orders directly from the deputy chief of the secret police, Alexandru Nicolski. The re-education program implemented in Pitesti prison was based on instruction sessions, torture and interrogations, and renouncement. The instruction sessions were the least violent part of the experiment. Prison guards would force the inmates to attend lectures on Stalinism, the flaws in the capitalist system, and other topics relevant to the feud between the East and West. The sessions were sometimes scheduled and sometimes random, but they were always mandatory. Often these instruction sessions were accompanied by violence and denouncement of crimes committed by the inmates. Turcanu and his assistants did not care who suffered from violent treatment during the information sessions, nor did they care if the prisoners were admitting to things they had actually done or not. They only cared if it reinforced the ideals of communism and the repentance of non-communist beliefs. On occasion, the prisoner director Dumitrescu would personally conduct beatings during these meetings. Though the instruction sessions often involved violence, it was not a guaranteed part of the meetings. The same cannot be said for the main part of the program, which was organized into 3 separate stages. The first stage was a preliminary interrogation, conducted with the aim of revealing anything that had been hidden from previous interrogators by the prisoner. Called external unmasking, the first stage focused on dragging intimate details of personal lives out of the prisoners, with torture being used to ensure results. Because of this, many inmates said whatever they thought would make the torture stop, admitting to things they had never done. The second stage of the program was dedicated to internal unmasking. This was a particularly interesting part of the experiment, as it was designed to internally calibrate the prison itself. Prisoners who were subjected to internal unmasking were asked to reveal any enemies of the party within the walls of the prison, i.e. anyone who had treated them less brutally than Turcanu and his cohort demanded. The more enemies a person revealed, real or imaginary, the more likely they were to be forced into the next phase of re-education. The third stage of the Pitesti prison re-education program took a stark turn away from the previous 2. The first 2 steps involved torture and relatively private interrogations, but the third step involved public humiliation. Victims of the third step had to forsake all their non-communist connections from their life before prison. Called public moral unmasking, the third stage forced prisoners to denounce all of their beliefs, values, friends, family, and loyalties. Perhaps most significantly, victims of the third stage had to openly blaspheme whatever religion they believed in and extensively denounce their religious beliefs. The process ended with the fourth stage, turning victims into abusers. Prisoners who had been successfully re-educated by the ODCC were given a new responsibility of re-educating others. Turning the tortured into torturers not only eliminated their ability to gain sympathy as victims, but it fully eliminated any friendship or companionship they had managed to build with their fellow prisoners. At any point during the process, a prisoner could fail one of the stages. Most significantly, they were sent all the way back to stage 1, regardless of whichever part of the process they had failed. This meant that prisoners had both the concrete reality of torture in the first 2 stages and the idea of further torture if they failed any part of the process as motivation to admit whatever crimes they felt their abusers would believe. The psychological burden of blaming others for crimes you know they did not commit can only be imagined. When combined with torture, public humiliation, and then the forced torture of others instead of yourself, the terror that resulted from the program can only be imagined. Disclaimer: before the techniques used in the Pitesti Prison Experiment are discussed, viewers should be advised that they are extremely disturbing and may be triggering. The enforcement of the re-education program was left in the hands of Eugen Turcanu and his hand-picked assistants. What they lacked in empathy or compassion, they made up for in creativity and brutality. The various methods of torture took place primarily in Room 4 Hospital, which had ironically been used as an infirmary in the early days of the prison. The most common form of torture was beatings. Turcanu and his thugs wielded clubs, boards, belts, and anything else they could use to inflict pain on their victims. Following Turcanu's cry of "Go get 'em, boys," the overseers would descend upon their chosen prisoner with sadistic delight. However, when more organized or psychologically tormenting methods were called for, Turcanu never failed to deliver. The torture used in the Pitesti experiment was as diverse as it was despicable. Weights weighing as much as 40 kilograms or 88 pounds were strapped to the backs of chosen prisoners for hours on end, until they either collapsed or the torturers decided they had had enough. Some prisoners were forced to stare at a lit light bulb until it harmed their eyes. Others had their hair systematically pulled out or their fingers and toes crushed. Chinese water torture was also used, especially in the more organized interrogations that took place in the first and second stages. Though these methods were brutal enough, Turcanu and his cronies didn't stop there. Sometimes, prisoners were forced to headbutt each other like rams, or eat excessively salty foods without any water to drink. Other times, they were forced to eat dangerously hot food with their hands, often off of the floor. Some were locked in solitary confinement for hours at a time, or forced to stand in the same place facing the wall all night. The cruelest torture, however, put all of these to shame. Turcanu liked to view himself as a sort of re-education master, and he loved to experiment with torture techniques that tested the boundaries of human psychological and physical endurance. He found an especially disgusting technique that accomplished both of these goals: excremental torture. As part of their punishments for sins real or imagined, prisoners were forced to urinate directly into the mouths of other prisoners. They were also forced to defecate into containers, which other prisoners were then forced to eat. Turcanu and the ODCC would also hang prisoners with their heads in a recently used toilet and force them to lick the sides of toilet bowls. All of these methods were used in a single goal: to force the prisoners of the Pitesti to recant anything in their lives that wasn't communist ideals, and to ensure that the terror imposed by Turcanu and his assistants completely outweighed any benefit of the prisoners banding together against the abuse. For over 2 years, Turcanu and the other overseers ruled Pitesti prison with an iron fist. Eventually, though, the abuses that were endemic to the prison were revealed to authorities in the Romanian government, or at least they could no longer hide their knowledge of them. When the United States and other Western countries began to accuse the Soviet bloc of human rights abuses, Romania decided to dump their dead weight. A purge of the entire government was conducted, with several high-ranking officials being exiled or imprisoned as rogue lunatics. For Eugen Turcanu, it was the end of the line. In an attempt to separate the horrific events in Pitesti prison from the government, a proxy investigation of the re-education program was launched. This investigation culminated in a secret trial, where Turcanu and the ODCC were found guilty of abuse and deadly violence. Turcanu himself was found guilty on 30 counts of murder and over 700 counts of abuse. November 4th, 1954, saw 20 death sentences handed out to the ODCC. Officially, Turcanu and 16 others were found guilty of serving the exiled remains of the Iron Guard and therefore acting as covert operatives. They were executed by firing squad. Alexandru Dumitrescu, the director of the prison, was also found guilty and executed. Though it only existed for less than 3 years, the Pitesti Prison Experiment led to death and suffering of massive proportions. Of the roughly 600 prisoners subjected to the experiment, nearly 100 died as a result of their treatment. 2 committed suicide, and more would have likely followed if the ODCC hadn't imposed incredibly strict anti-suicidal measures. The background of the prisoners makes the suffering they endured even harder to bear. The majority of them were students, whose only crime was not being communist. The others were people convicted of various misdemeanors. The torture used by Turcanu and his men would have been impossible to justify even against the war criminals of the Second World War. To use them against students and petty thieves is nearly unfathomable. Pitesti Prison now stands as a testament to the worst side of human nature: the ability to shamelessly abuse and torture others. Tourists can visit the site and be given a tour, as well as an explanation of the horrors that occurred there. Though the Romanian government never embraced such a violent re-education program again, the damage had been done. The hundreds of souls who suffered through the Pitesti experiment will forever serve as a memory of what happens when authority, vengeance, and terror are allowed to run wild.